Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video I'm going to go over this week's affixes in Mythic Plus, along with some tips for adjusting and a heads up on some of the difficult situations coming your way. Today we're shooting from Pandaria, because I was flying to do my dailies and I remembered I didn't do this video yet because I spent 15 hours yesterday playing Mythic Plus. This week is Tyrannical, Teeming, Volcanic. I would describe this week as a very slow week, but fairly easy. Tyrannical slows things down a lot, and Teeming only makes it worse by adding more mobs to the dungeon and increasing the amount of mobs you need to clear for full count. You won't have to deal with annoyances like Sanguine or Grievous, however dungeons will simply just be much slower. You'll probably not see any serious teams competing this week, however if you're still in the 19 or lower key range, you actually may find this week better to pug than last. Like many other bad Tyrannical weeks, the theme of this week is just to pack in as much damage as possible while still being able to survive the bosses. Teeming is an affix that's quite annoying. It adds various mobs and packs to the dungeon and also increases the amount of count required, so you can't be skipping much. It isn't fortified, so you won't have many issues with the pulls, however it still slows you down, especially in areas where you're limited by what you can pull based off of interrupts for important casts. As a healer, there's not much you can do to counteract teeming other than to prioritize damage, and be ready for the occasional extra mob and packs that your team might not be ready to interrupt or stop right away. When I go over each dungeon in detail, I'll look over some of the more difficult packs that teeming brings. Volcanic is the easiest affix on the calendar, both for time and difficulty. Volcanic is almost always entirely avoidable and costs you little to no time. Druids have a quite easy time with it, considering you can cast many of the rotational spells while moving, so having to constantly reposition isn't too much of a loss. Volcanic targets players at range of the mobs, so if you're playing with a melee heavy group, be prepared for lots of them to spawn on you. Most people find this affix fairly straightforward and easy to combat, so I won't bore you with it much longer. Just remember that, as a druid, you can use bark skin while stunned in case you get stunned into a volcano. Now let's look at the dungeons this week. I'm going to briefly go over each one in Mythic Dungeon Tools so you have a heads up on what to expect this week. First, let's look at Atal. So the most annoying part about Atal during teaming is that there is randomness as to what packs that spawn. There is a pack over here that can spawn with double Colossus or with double Caster, and there's also a pack over here that can spawn in the middle. So you have to have a route planned for either one. None of these pulls are going to be too terribly difficult on teaming. You may find yourself wanting to pull this middle pack for the 11% count that it gives. It's not too difficult. Another pack is these 3 Sky Screamers. If you don't have interrupts ready for this and you pull this, you'll need those. Other than that, Atal won't be too challenging in terms of execution as long as you can deal with Volcal on Tyrannical, although there are no other affixes that would make it harder. I wouldn't consider Volcanic very difficult here. So for essences, although sometimes I would run something else, in this week I'm just running my normal essence setup of Crucible, Well, Formless, and Conflict. And for talents, I'm just running my normal setup as well. You may find some druids running Mass Entanglement in this dungeon just to help facilitate some of the skips for pulling the obelisks without pulling the packs near them, but it's not necessary for most of the dungeon. Now let's look at Freehold. This is, I would say, not a very good week for Freehold. Eudora and Raoul is active, which is not a very good combo. Also, it's Tyrannical, so the first 2 bosses are going to be quite difficult. Teeming isn't too bad in here because in general you can just pull more stuff. There's not any packs that are too dangerous. Volcanic, again, not too dangerous of an affix. Freehold won't be too difficult, but it'll just be slow. You'll have to be pulling lots and lots of mobs, and all the bosses will take a very long time. There's nothing really to worry about here in terms of pulls. You're just mainly worried about the first 2 bosses. So for this reason, I usually like to take Soul of the Forest and Prosperity in Freehold just to be able to burst heal in the first 2. Otherwise, I'm not changing my essences too much. Now let's look at Kingsrust. Kingsrust can be kind of annoying on teaming. So one thing that you have to worry about is there's a purification construct in this room that patrols. This guy makes doing these Embalming Fluid's much more difficult and also just takes a very long time to kill because he has a lot of health. Another spot that it can be annoying is there's a Witch Doctor in this pack. Very often you combine these two packs together as your first pull in this room, but because there's two Witch Doctors, that will not be recommended in a pug. The only other thing is the Brute. There's an extra Brute in right here that doesn't patrol, it just sits here, which makes this area even more dangerous and slower as well. Otherwise, it's not too hard of a dungeon to heal. It's just very, very slow because of all these mobs that force you to break up pulls. Kingsrust, because of the single target healing, is another dungeon where I think Prosperity and Soul of the Forest can be good. The toughest parts will be getting through Kula the Butcher and the last boss and the first boss on Tyrannical, all of which are mostly single target healing fights. If you wanted to run Scenario and Word Cultivation, I think those are fine too. This is just some people's preference to run Soul Prosperity. And for essences, if you're having trouble healing the bosses, you can swap out Formless Void for Preservation Minor to boost your regrowths to help your single target healing, but otherwise you may want to run Formless just for the extra damage because the dungeon is going to be slow. Let's look at Shrine. Shrine is fairly easy this week. Teeming becomes a big problem because generally people try and skip as many of these mini bosses at a time. So in Teeming, you can't necessarily skip all the mobs that you want, so you're probably going to have to end up pulling some of these mini bosses. But it is Tyrannical, so the bosses won't take too long. This can be a really dangerous area too because there's more Tide Sage Enforcers, there's more everything in every pack here. You have to be careful with what you pull in this first area because even though it's not fortified, on higher keys the water bolts from the attendants will still do a lot of damage. There's not really any tough healing checks in this dungeon. It's more of a matter of just do you have the coordination and damage to get through it. In Shrine, I like to run a more damage heavy build, not only because it helps with the timer, but especially because it helps with the last boss, because it's a phase based boss that gives you a damage buff, so every amount of damage that you can add for that boss helps a ton. Shrine is a dungeon where I would probably just stick to my normal build of Cenarian Word Cultivation, and you may want to consider swapping out Well for Ever Rising Tide just for a little extra damage boost, because you won't necessarily need the healing from Well in this dungeon. Now let's look at Siege. Siege is very similar to Shrine in that there's not a lot of tough healing checks that are required, and it's going to be really, really slow on time. The second boss and the last boss are phase-based bosses, so you want as much single target damage as possible to try and help skip phases. The first boss as well, it's good to have some single target damage as well to burst during the bombs. This is going to be a really slow week for Siege. Teeming is very difficult in Siege because the way that it adds the way that it calculates how many mobs you need is a percentage based amount, and because there's lots of mobs in Siege that you don't normally kill, the amount of extra mobs that you have to kill during Teeming goes up a lot, so you essentially have to pull nearly every mob in the dungeon when you go through in a straight line to get enough count for the dungeon. On top of that, there's no bolstering or raging to help with the spotter, so you're gonna have to kill everything the old-fashioned way. Again, Siege is a place where I like to run more damage, so this is another dungeon where you may consider swapping out Well for Ever Rising Tide, and I like running Crucible Major here as well. If you're having problems with the last boss, I find that Prosperity Soul is very strong for dealing with the burst damage from the Putrid Waters, but otherwise most of the dungeon, Cenarian Word Cultivation, I think is stronger, so it may depend on preference. This is also a dungeon where if you're having problems with your tank, you can consider Stonebark, just because you don't really get too much value from Spring Blossoms anyway, because there's not a lot of healing required. Now let's look at Temple. Temple is not too bad of a dungeon this week. I would say Temple is the one dungeon where Tyrannical doesn't feel too bad, just because you have to dedicate a lot of cooldowns and time to the bosses anyway, and the last boss isn't necessarily affected much by Tyrannical, so you don't get slowed down as much in Temple as you do in other dungeons. Teeming has two pretty difficult parts to it in Temple. There's the Shrouded Fangs that have really nasty patrols. There's two in this room that go around in a complete circle, and one here that goes all the way down this bridge. Two things to consider here are that these guys cheap shot out of stealth, and if they hit your tank and stun them, it'll be impossible for the tank to get threat. So you have to be really, really careful whenever you pull these mobs. Even if they don't do as much damage, they can cause the tank to get stunned and then either die or threat gets pulled on DPS. Also, these Crowlusk hatchlings sometimes desync from the patrol, and if you count on getting the one count from these, you have to make sure you get these, because if the Fang dies without the hatchling will disappear. The other pull is the 5 Dervish pull here in Galvast. I don't know why this pull is still in the game, but it's extremely difficult. On Tyrannical, you probably don't want to expend Lust to this because the boss is coming and you usually want to use Lust for Galvast. But you want to pull around this and have lots of cooldowns for this pack. This pack will very likely not be doable on very high keys like 27s and 28s that people are doing now. So for Temple, I like to run Formless Void Major if I have a Lucid Major that I can steal for mana. This allows me to steal Lucid for the boss and then also use Focusing Iris or Blood or some other damage essence for the trash that I don't need the mana for. Then that lets me add both Well and ERT. This is a really strong healing setup if you're worried about healing bosses. You can experiment with other healing majors though. I've been doing some things like trying to play with World Vein Major just for a little extra damage while still boosting my healing, or you could go with the classic Memory of Lucid Dreams just to help with the mana if you don't have one that you can steal. Otherwise, I think Crucible is a fine option. I think there's lots of options that you can run in Temple. It all comes down to how much help that you think you need on the bosses and how much damage that you think you need as well. Just make sure while you're swapping around your essences that if you're relying on the -10 corruption resistance that you get that in there. In terms of talents, I highly recommend the default setup of Cenarian Ward, Cult, and Spring Blossoms just for the added mastery and the group healing, since most of Temple is going to be group healing. Next, let's look at Motherlode. Motherlode's another dungeon where Tyrannical doesn't feel super bad. The bosses are fairly easy, and the difficult part of this dungeon is usually this first part with all the trash. You want to pull as many of these Peacekeepers as possible because it's going to be hard to get count in here. Just be careful that there may be some mobs that added in with teaming, so you can't necessarily pull exactly how you would before. There's not going to be too much difficulty in here. In the first area, you just want to make sure you always keep people topped because there's lots of random damage from the thug charges as well as the mech jockey grease guns. And this area after the second or the first boss rather is very similar to that too. You'll have to pull a lot more trash than you'd expect in here, but because it's Tyrannical, the trash dies fairly quickly, so it won't be too much of a challenge. There's not any really difficult parts in here, so I like to optimize for damage on a week like this in Motherlode as well. I'll run my default setup of Cenarian Ward Cultivation, although I think Soul Prosperity is fine too. And I'll run my normal Essence setup of Crucible, Well, Formless, and Conflict. You can swap out Well for a higher damage essence like Ever Rising Tide as well if you wish. One thing I guess I want to mention too real quick is the last 2 bosses can be very heavy with magic damage. So if you have a tank that isn't very good against dealing with magic damage, maybe like a Prot Warrior, you will need to be healing them a lot. It'll be very easy all the way up until this point, and then once you get to Rixa, the tank might actually require a lot of healing. So just don't fall asleep in this one. Next, let's look at Underrot. Underrot isn't too bad this week. Teeming creates kind of an annoying situation where you're looking for extra mobs to pull. However, both of these packs are insanely difficult. Generally, groups run in between these 2 packs here. However, there's an issue where this pack is bigger now, so you have to be really careful not to pull this. This is a good place to use Shroud if you have that available, because in Pugs you'll probably pull this and then die. Otherwise, there is a Fallen Death Speaker in this pack with the Defilers. Generally, Pugs can barely handle kicks on the 2 Defilers alone, and when you introduce a Death Speaker, things might get scary. So you may want to CC this mob while you deal with these. Since this is so far into the dungeon, you usually know if you have enough time or not. This is going to be a fairly typical week for Underrot. It should not be too bad. The only boss that may be difficult is Cragmaw, but there are no other affixes that would make it harder. I like running my normal talent setup here with Cultivation, Cenarian Ward, Spring Blossoms. You can also run lost my train of thought, but I would run my normal essence setup here as well. Crucible, Well, Formless, and Conflict. I wouldn't, some people like to swap out essences because they're worried about the second boss, but I wouldn't recommend running a healing major for Kragmaw because you can usually heal through Kragmaw with a good rotation, and you're going to be slowed down for the rest of the dungeon without running either Crucible or Formless. Let's look at Toldagor. Toldagor is actually not too bad this week. Teeming doesn't make it too bad. You do have to do some extra pulls that you otherwise wouldn't want to, but that's the same in every dungeon. Toldagor is just going to be a matter of going through the dungeon in a straight line and dealing with the bosses. You may want to pull some extra mobs in the brig area. This pack with the thug that patrols is going to have an extra striker and an arsonist, so this will be worth more count. You'll probably just want to pull a little extra on average, but otherwise it's not too terribly difficult. It's just a matter of living through the bosses. You may want to encourage your team to spec into spells that make the cannons easier. In Pugs, they may not always be running Binding Shot or Ring of Frost as a hunter or a mage, but those are very good spells to have that make the cannons easier. But there's not a lot you can always do as a healer. In Toldagor, I like running my normal Essence setup, Cenarian Ward, Cultivation, Spring Blossoms, as well as my normal Essence setup. I think Formless Void Major is also pretty strong in here. It allows you to steal Lucid for the first and last boss, and you can use Focusing Iris for some of the bigger trash pulls as well that you'll be needing to do on Tyrannical. You can just swap your last Minor Essence with Ever-Rising Tide. Next, let's look at Waycrest. Waycrest on Teeming doesn't change too much. There's a couple packs that get really scary. This pack in the hallway with 3 infested peasants can get a bit scary because of the withering globs. They just randomly target players. I think there's another one right here. Also, there's this pack on the left of the sister room, so just be ready that this pack right here can be a lot scarier than you're otherwise used to. There's also an extra witch here, but none of these packs are too terribly scary because, again, it is not fortified, so you can deal with most trash packs as long as you're playing reasonably. This is a dungeon where a lot of the pulls can be a bit challenging, but nothing's going to be that crazy. The hardest areas will probably be the sisters and Lord and Lady Waycrest, so you may want to spec for those. I like running Ever-Rising Tide Major in here with Well, Preservation, and Conflict. However, I've also been experimenting with World Vein Major. World Vein is a little bit easier on your mana, so Ever-Rising Tide is good for the trash pulls and burst healing, but if you're trying to use Ever-Rising Tide during the Sisters or during the 4th boss, you may run out of mana if you're misusing it. World Vein is just a nice button that you can press that helps your mana, or rather helps your healing, and helps your throughput that you would use just like you would use Ever-Rising Tide. It's definitely weaker for healing. However, it might be a good idea to use in Pugs where you don't necessarily want to be slamming Fish Feast and Mana Pots anyway, and you're not comfortable with your mana usage. Otherwise, I think if you can get through the bosses, it would probably be fine to just run a normal build with Crucible or even Formless Major in here as well. This is just my recommendations and what I like to do. Same talent setup as well. Next, let's look at Junkyard. I'll be honest, I don't even know what changes in Teeming in Junkyard. There's just so much everywhere, and you don't really have a route. You just walk around with Zapbots and kill everything. None of the trash pulls will be that hard because you have Zapbots. One thing I recently found out, I don't know if it's true, but it seems that way, is that the Zapbots are actually boosted by Fortified, which is kind of ridiculous, but so this dungeon is particularly harder on Tyrannical weeks. I don't know if 100% that's true, but from looking at logs, it seems like that's the case. You're generally just going to be wanting to spec to make sure that you can get through all the bosses. Trixie and Nano are pretty easy, but all the other bosses can be a bit more challenging. This is a dungeon where I've been experimenting with majors as well. My traditional setup was Ever-Rising Tide with Well and Preservation, but because the toughest parts of the dungeon are usually the bosses, you may consider running Formless Major or Lucid Major just for the extra mana, and that way you can run Ever-Rising Tide in place here as well for even more mana and intellect. For talents, I'll run my normal talent build. Sometimes I choose to run Guardian Affinity in here because I don't feel the damage from Feral Affinity is that necessary. However, it's a hard trade-off because you also lose the movement speed, so I've kind of been going back and forth on this one. Also, Mass Root can be very useful for the last boss if your team is having problems with the bots. So sometimes I'll run Mastered in here on weeks where there's no Sanguine or I don't feel the need to run Typhoon. And last, let's look at Workshop. Workshop is not too different on teaming. However, Tyrannical makes it very difficult. The one change that you need to remember with teaming is generally when you get to this last area with the last obelisk, you kill this first pack, then you skip ahead with the obelisk. However, that actually is not enough count this week. You need to pull one of these defense bots in with this last pack, so be sure that you do that. If you go through your normal route this week, you will just end up at the last boss with not enough count. The hardest part of this dungeon for sure is dealing with the last boss and maybe the first boss as well if your team isn't coordinated with dealing with the hammers. So just keep that in mind. You can almost fully spec for just trying to deal with this last boss if you're confident that your team can go through the dungeon in a straight line with enough damage. I like to run my normal essence setup here and talent setup as well. I like to run Crucible Major just for damage. I'll swap out Formless for Preservation just for the extra single target healing, specifically for the last boss. If you find that you're running out of mana on the last boss, again, Formless Major or Lucid Major is another option as well, just to help with your mana and still do a little bit of extra damage on trash. And that's it. That wraps up all the dungeons. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked it and subscribe to my channel. I'll be making a new video each week with all the affix combinations as well as lots more high-level Mythic Plus content all the way through Shadowlands. Happy keying!